Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diane Smith, and I'm a member of the marketing department here at Riverwoods in the Exeter community. And I want to thank you all for taking the time to learn a little bit about Riverwoods while also hearing a wonderful presentation from Jeff Feingold about the economic outlook. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. You are on mute, but we welcome your questions. So we encourage you to include your questions in our Q&A. And this workshop is being recorded and will be sent out following the presentation. So you don't have to take a lot of notes. We want you to sit back, be comfortable. Your suggestions on how we can improve these are always welcome. So we appreciate your feedback. It's very important to us that we impart this information in the way that is best for you. And also, if you have an idea for a future topic, let us know. We are open and willing. We wish we were doing this in person with you. We would have prior to COVID, and hopefully, as Jeff and I just said, next year we hope that we can do it in person with you. But for now, we're Zooming, and we're thankful for that, and look forward to connecting with you at some point in the future. So a little bit about Riverwoods before we get started. Our communities, the Riverwoods group, we have, as I mentioned, I'm in Exeter. There are 3 campuses in Exeter. We have Birch Hill, which is in Manchester, and our newest community in Durham opened up just a year ago. So 3 self-contained, vibrant, energetic communities. So we are what you call a CCRC. So that's an acronym for Continuing Care Retirement Community. And you hear that a lot. Really, it's an insurance product. Although we've had some grandchildren who describe this as Grandma and Grandpa's Country Club. But we are a long-term care insurance product. So there's an entrance fee based on the size of the apartment that you choose. A portion of that is refundable, and a portion of your monthly fee is also tax deductible. So more details if you want to learn a little bit more about us and the CCRC concept, we're happy to follow up with you and answer any of those questions. So important to know, when you are coming to Riverwoods, you need to be independent. So we qualify you to make sure that you can live safely on your own. And then you become free to play and enjoy life without the worry of maintenance. We can take you places. We provide transportation services. We have a full cadre of all kinds of activities, programs, educational programs. So lots of options to be active or not to be active. But most importantly, as our founders, the mission of our founders was to secure an environment where you can live safely for the rest of your life and not have to worry about healthcare. And that is the real value. When you come here, you are guaranteed long-term care in a private room for the rest of your life. So that's a little bit about Riverwoods and the CCRC. So now about our speaker, Jeff Feingold. We're thrilled that he is part of our little community today. And so he is the editor of NHBR. He has worked for over 25 years. He has won several journalism awards, including the New Hampshire Press Association's Writer of the Year and Editorial Writer of the Year honors. He has also worked as a freelance writer. His work has been published in several local, regional, and national publications, including the New York Times and The Nation. He has spent much of his career covering government and politics at local, state, and national levels, from planning and school boards to presidential campaigns. He has been a regular panelist on public affairs shows and on both public and commercial TV and radio. And I mentioned before the program that I've heard him on NHBR, and he's going to be on there again in another few weeks. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Diane. I really appreciate that introduction, and you're being too kind, but that's okay. I'll take that.
Good.
Anyway, I'm really thrilled to be here, everybody. I thank everybody at Riverwoods for inviting me. It's interesting because it was almost exactly a year ago, I was delivering a presentation on the prospects of the New Hampshire economy. It was in March of 2020 at a gathering of the Portsmouth Chamber Collaborative. And it turns out that that was the last public event I've been to since then, where there were other people in the room with me. And the coronavirus had there had been some cases in the United States. There had been a few deaths, the first death that occurred, and no one was really sure what it was going to mean for the economy. But we did know at the time that China was being decimated and international supply chains were already being strained and often crippled, but we never really knew what the effects were going to be. So the talk at the time, they were talking about SARS and that it would go away and not really affect the United States as much. But there was also this unsettling sense that this could get worse. So I spent the bulk of my presentation last year talking about the headwinds facing New Hampshire's economy, leaving the coronavirus as the last part of the discussion, because if you remember at the beginning, coronavirus was the name and COVID-19 hadn't even been coined yet. So at the end there, I was pretty much warning of potential devastation to the economy. But I just was guessing like everybody else was, because I had done a lot of research talking to a lot of economists in preparation for my talk, and they all said the same thing. This could be absolutely terrible, but we don't know. So like, who knew? So at the time last year, in early spring, late winter, the New Hampshire economy actually was still chugging along pretty nicely after having an unusually slow rebound from the Great Recession. Aside from the virus, the major concern for my talk was the state of the state's manufacturing sector. Since the early 2000s, there's been a strong relationship between aerospace and manufacturing employment in this state. So the big story last year was the grounding of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Two major manufacturers in New Hampshire, on the seacoast actually, Safran and Albany International, both supply parts for it. In fact, Safran makes the plane's LEAP engine, a special engine for it, and Albany supplies key parts for that engine. So weakened supply chain, the ongoing trade war, and the grounding of the 737 MAX added to concerns about the future, the potential for an effect on the larger New Hampshire manufacturing aerospace economy as a whole. But things still look pretty good, certainly from a consumer spending perspective, because the consumer at the time in the US economy and New Hampshire as well, consumer spending was really fueling our successful economy at the time, particularly in hospitality and retail. The real estate market was very strong, although there was an ever-increasing shortage of homes for sale, with prices rising almost every month. But a year later, as we know, it's a much different story, except for the real estate part, and we'll get to that in a little while. But first, let's take a quick look at New Hampshire's economy. As you can see here, New Hampshire has, this is the most recent data that I can get a hold of, which was 2019, $77.9 billion gross state product. Population over 1.3 million, and there are over 53,000 individual businesses in New Hampshire. Now, for people who are not familiar with New Hampshire, a large percentage of those businesses in New Hampshire are small businesses, especially when defined by the Small Business Administration's definition of 500 employees or less. In fact, I would say that maybe 0.1% of those businesses actually in New Hampshire actually are above 500 employees, or pretty close to that. So that's something. It's very much a small business driven economy. But the state GDP, the gross state product there, is really interesting. It's not clear what happened to the GDP last year in 2020. The numbers have not been released yet. But I would guess, really, considering even what we've been through, that it's going to still be in that range again, but when all's said and done. And I think that's because while the state was slammed economically in the spring, it did emerge pretty quickly. I mean, by summer was for the most part back on track. Obviously, we'll get into the details. Not everything was, but there were certain aspects of the economy that did show strength. I can go to slide 8 now, please, Kaylee. Thanks. I wanted to say one of the things about New Hampshire's economy that makes it so strong is its wealth, the relative wealth of its population. The median income we see here for 2019 was $77,000, which is the 7th highest in the country. And actually, the household income in New Hampshire is $114,800, which is the 6th highest in the country, behind only Connecticut, the District of Columbia, Maryland, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. So we're really in very strong company when you think about DC and Maryland in particular. Those are economies that are very much driven by a very stable employer known as the federal government. So New Hampshire has, when I talk about consumer spending, when I talk about the consumers driving the economy, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So we have people with money to spend, and it's one of the strengths of New Hampshire's economy in the last 30 years, probably. Slide 9, please, Kaylee. Okay, now the thing about New Hampshire is we've had a extremely low unemployment rate for probably close to 25 years. Starting in the late 80s and early 90s, New Hampshire essentially went through a depression in the real estate market. It was really a serious blow. If you remember that recession, it was in the late 80s. It was one of the reasons that George H.W. Bush was only a one-term president. And in fact, things were really bad in New Hampshire, so bad in New Hampshire that in October 1991, 5 of the largest banks in the state were shut down by the feds on the very same day. And that was because they were driven by bad real estate loans. It had obviously a rippleable effect through our economy. But interestingly, New Hampshire started a trend that continued until just the Great Recession, that once there was a downturn, New Hampshire bounced back very quickly. We had a strong employment rate all the way through. The unemployment rate was really so long that it was in the 2 to 3% range, that it just seemed like that was the normal thing. And as you can see from that chart there, you can see New Hampshire is the black line. You can see how much lower it is in the nation, and really it does hover in that 2 to 3% range for several months and years, I mean. So anyway, and you could look at that big spike there. That's April 2020. COVID did a real number on New Hampshire at the start of the pandemic. The state's jobless rate rose from 2.4% in March of 2020 to 17% 1 month later. It was even higher than the national rate, and that hadn't happened in years, when New Hampshire had a higher unemployment rate than the national rate. And at first, unemployment hit every sector in New Hampshire hard, but most of them recovered pretty well. As you can see by the numbers here, the unemployment rate started going down almost immediately. So by November 2020, New Hampshire's unemployment rate was down in the 4% range, a little bit lower. But not, of course, right now we're seeing that this is pretty much the unemployment rate we're seeing. It's hovering there, it's staying in that 4% range, high 3%, because for two major factors. It's hospitality and retail, especially the hospitality sector, which is lodging and entertainment and restaurants in particular. And those sectors, while they have bounced back somewhat, and in some cases, pretty significantly, they still have a long way to go. And that is those are two of the key reasons that the unemployment rate is still, by New Hampshire standards. I mean, most states would kill for 4% unemployment rate, but by New Hampshire standards, that's a relatively high one. And it's one of the main reasons for that is that New Hampshire's workforce. Well, one of the things we write about in New Hampshire Business Review, probably every issue now for a good 15, 20 years, is the workforce shortage, the labor shortage. We have an older population, demographically speaking. New Hampshire is one of the oldest states in the nation. Usually it's the top three is Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And we usually battle out to see who's number one. And I believe Maine is number one right now, but New Hampshire's right behind it. And because of that, we have a workforce that's ages out in many cases, in many industries. So it's hard for employers to find new employees. And also because of that, the workforce isn't regenerated at the kind of rate that a strong economy like New Hampshire's would need to fill jobs. So there are many sectors like manufacturing, construction, healthcare, where you read about these just openings all the time for relatively good jobs. Actually, some of them are excellent paying jobs, and it's hard to find employees. So that's one of the reasons why we have this low unemployment rate. That's a blessing, but also it could be a kind of a curse for individual businesses. I also want to talk a little bit about just what else makes up the economy, and that's real estate and construction are very important economic engines to the state. And it was the real estate market that has driven previous economic booms in New Hampshire, as businesses and people from other states, and primarily Massachusetts, moved here because of lower home prices, rents, and taxes. Not property taxes, that's a whole other story, but taxes in general. So the trend of this growing economy continued into 2020 as the pandemic took hold. More people from urban areas, Boston and New York in particular, started moving to New Hampshire to see what the safety of rural areas or whatever, because they would perceive as a better place to be, fewer crowds or all that stuff. And they've been snapping up available homes in less populated areas of the state. And that's one of the great the phenomenon we've seen. It's happened all over the state, actually, in many rural areas. And one of that is like a resounding vote in favor of remote working by a lot of people. So the result has been a red hot housing market during COVID. And as you can see here, the median real estate price, if you can see this slide, I'll read it to you, for a single family home in between December 2019 and December 2020, this is 1 year, rose from $299,000 to $349,900, a 16.6% increase in 1 year. The number of days a home remains on the market has been falling for a couple of years now. And in fact, it's now down to 33 days, and it was 63 days, which is only 2 months, in December 2019. And by December 2020, it fell 50% to 33 days. And if you could see the sales numbers there, they have followed suit. I mean, the sales have rose 25% in those years. The only problem is, which it's great for sellers, but if you're a buyer, you are just really competing against everybody. There's a lack of inventory. There is just so few houses on the market that in December 2020, it was 0.9 of 1 month of supply, which is what, 27 days. And actually, that was bad, and it was even worse. It was even bad in 2019. It was only 2.4 months of supply, which means basically it would take 2.4 months to sell all of the homes in inventory if they were never replaced. So we're talking about 0.9 of a month. But to make matters worse, I checked the most recent numbers, and we are down to 0.7 tenths of a month, 7/10 of a month, I mean, and that's about 24 days. So we're running out of inventory. It's been getting bad, worse and worse, and prices got higher and higher and higher. And it's mostly the result of the lack of inventory, but in other cases, it's also, as I talked about, this continuing workforce shortage, which prevents a more robust building sector, but also there's been a major problem nationally, not just in New Hampshire, of rising prices for building supplies. Actually, the price of lumber alone has gone up 180% since last spring. So there's all these factors playing into it, but New Hampshire in particular, because of its very hot, very tight housing market, housing prices are going up a lot. And if you can go to the next slide, I could show you a little bit what that means. And that is, if you're a renter in New Hampshire, the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, as reported by the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, was $1,413, $1,413 in 2020, which was a 22% rise since 2016. And if you can go to the next slide, Kaylee, to put that into perspective, here's what that means for the state's renters, many of whom are among the most vulnerable of our population. According to the Housing Authority, 47% of all the renters in the state pay more than 30% of their income on rent. Another 28% pay 20 to 30%. So as rents continue to rise, and they are rising, the situation for renters will only become worse. And I just wanted to say, I just want to pause there for a second. The reason this is a concern is, as I said, we're trying to attract people to move into the state who are younger. And with rising housing prices, and after competing against people who have, in many cases, cash to pay for homes, because you're selling a home in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts for, let's say $1 million. You could buy a beautiful house in, some part of northern New Hampshire for $400,000 or $500,000 or less. And while that's really reasonable if you have $1 million, if you're just starting out, you're just out of luck on finding a place to live. And if we have limited places to live, it's hard to attract people. It's hard to attract employees. It's hard to attract young people to the state. So that's why that's such a concern for economists and public policy people in New Hampshire. But anyway, I've talked about some of the concerns that were coming up. Those are some of the things I talked about last year, but also are very much a concern this year. And it only, in many ways, the COVID just exacerbated it. Anyway, since that talk, let's say since the passage of the first stimulus bill last year, obviously things started getting better with word about the vaccinations, with more optimism emerging. The economy nationally and in New Hampshire obviously rebooted itself. And it looks like we're all back on track, made great strides actually in many cases in the past year. And it does look like, from the economists I've talked to, that they are very confident that if things remain on the same track that we have, where there's, a couple of million people or more getting vaccinated every day, where there's a more of a optimistic view of things, where there's seems to be more confidence in the economy, then things will really actually have the potential to become very, very strong. Maybe not at the end of this year, but let's say into 2022, and certainly by 23, there are many economists are saying that the economy could be extremely strong. But I'm not saying that this is a reason to have like reckless reopenings of states, which is what's happening in other parts of the country. Fortunately, not in New Hampshire, because that would only set off, it has the potential of getting a lot of things off track. So those are really concerns on individual state levels, and we're hoping that cooler heads prevail on that, and wiser heads actually on that issue. But I don't think we can overstate the uncertainty that hovered over all of us in the opening months of the pandemic. That's disappearing. But don't get me wrong, I'm not sounding the all clear, and there definitely is a different mindset from a year ago that is reflected in the economy, both nationally and locally. And I think the biggest difference is that we are really seeing light at the end of the tunnel, while last year, that tunnel was a long way and you had no idea what was in front of you. So I would like to talk a little bit about by far a sector in the state, in New Hampshire's economy, that has performed very well. And this is true also nationally as well. This is not just New Hampshire. I'm not just talking about New Hampshire when I mention this. The numbers are specifically in New Hampshire, but manufacturing has been pretty strong, has rebounded pretty strongly in general after the initial problems with COVID. Because first of all, in New Hampshire, it's a very important economic sector, not just based on its size. As you can see, they had 70,000 manufacturing employees in 2019. It's the compensation that's really important. You think about it. We're talking about 83,000 in 2018 for the average annual compensation. And by now, as I've talked about with the labor shortage, it's certainly higher than that. And it's really it's this sector that when you talk to people whose job it is to attract businesses and employers to the state, they focus very much on manufacturing. And this is not news. This is what most states do because of that economic impact, because because of the people who work there are paid well, and it means have much more of an impact economically for the state. And it's interesting because in 2018, this is numbers I found that I can't find more updated ones. I apologize. Manufacturing represented 11.63% of the total output of the state. It was almost $10 billion in output from just manufacturing in New Hampshire. And we saw that GDP was about 78 billion. So that really does make a big difference. And as I said earlier, manufacturers, like most businesses, were affected by the pandemic early. Many of them shut down operations pretty much immediately, but they did open relatively quickly after the governor issued his stay-at-home orders. Other people call those lockdowns, because he did say that almost every kind of manufacturing business was an essential business, no matter what product they produced. So it was up to the manufacturers to come up with ways to open up safely and keep their employees safe, but they were able to bring their employees back. So what you had, instead of just shutdowns and like a restaurant having to figure out how to sell their food, online and do takeout orders only, manufacturers had to figure out how to, maybe have more shifts with fewer people in the plant at the same, to provide more opportunity for social distancing. So their problem was their problems were not on the production side, but they have been since COVID started. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that the supply chains were severely weakened and even crippled in many cases for manufacturers because of that reliance on international supply chains. And at the beginning, with China being hit so hard, and other Asian nations which supply a lot of our supply chains, which provide products that are used in the supply chain, it really affected manufacturers a lot in terms of finding products and actually producing things. But in other ways, COVID presented an opportunity for manufacturers in New Hampshire, because many of them quickly shifted to producing products that will be used in fighting the pandemic. We have Millipore Sigma, which has played a key role in developing all kinds of medical treatments for COVID, to Lonza Biologics has a major plant in New Hampshire where key ingredients for the Moderna vaccine are produced. But we all had companies making breathing apparatus, making special kinds of air purifiers. They quickly adapted to it and were able to do pretty well, actually. I want to go to, is this slide 15? I hope so. what happened was, if you could take a look at this slide, you could see how the pandemic affected businesses. And New Hampshire here is the blue bar, which is the second from the left, I believe. Over 25% of New Hampshire businesses were forced to reduce hours at some point in the pandemic. That includes manufacturing and healthcare providers, which are forced to curtail operations that weren't COVID related at first. That's the healthcare providers. But almost 50% for a certain period of time during the pandemic told employers that they shouldn't even come to work. And I would say that the bulk of that were businesses in lodging and retail. And the ones all on the left, the establishments that increased hours were, I believe, probably healthcare providers for certain employees and manufacturers who were able to remain open. But the bulk of those businesses on the right, though, they really had major hits. They just took major hits during the pandemic, as I said before. And as you can see from this chart, how that affected their hours. And you're talking about 50% of employers saying to their employees, "Don't come to work." That's not a good thing for the business in any way. So when I go to slide 16, Kaylee. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing right now in New Hampshire. And I want to thank Brian Gottlob, who's an economist, Polycon Research, and he also does work for the state. He was mentioning this, that, if you remember back in April and May, there was all this confidence about we're going to have a V recovery. It'll be a quick drop down to the bottom and a quick, rise up to make a V. Well, as you can see from this, the V is not actually complete yet. We're about halfway there. And he calls this a swoosh recovery, which, if you can see by that line, you can see that it's coming back up, and now it's not coming up quite much anymore. It's kind of swooshing over. There's not a straight line up. So what it's kind of showing is that we are on track. We've regained. New Hampshire lost, actually, I should have mentioned this before, from March 2020 to April 2020, New Hampshire lost 120,000 jobs. Now, that's a state that has about 700,000 or so. So, the recovery began about a month later, but through November, we still only regained 60,000 of those jobs. So we have a way to go, which is actually, it sounds bad, but there is a lot of optimism that it's going to happen by the end of this year, maybe, probably next year. But of those 60,000 jobs that need to be regained, over a fifth are in accommodations and restaurants. Another 15% are in state and local governments, and another 15% are in retail. So that's 50% of those jobs that are lost, that still have to be regained, are in those three sectors. And if you could look at what these latest stimulus packages, the one passed in December, and certainly the one that's apparently going to be passed today, the last I looked, I haven't got an alert on my phone yet, but it's supposedly the House is going to vote on it today. And that's going to have aid targeted to these specific sectors. And I think that is the kind of help that's really needed for them, because, all the help of helping them open by saying, well, you can have 25% capacity, 50% capacity. For most restaurants, that doesn't do the trick, because it's a low margin business anyway. Anybody who's been in the business, in the restaurant business in particular, knows that. So they need to have this be as full capacity, or have the potential to be at full capacity. So if they have some aid coming from the government through the next several months, as more people are vaccinated, as more people feel comfortable to go out, I do think that that's going to help. We will actually see this rebound. Maybe not the complete V, but it's going to be heading back in that direction. And this is also shown in this interesting chart. It's Moody's CNN Back to Normal Index, which measures the percentage of the economy that's in quote unquote normal operations. New Hampshire is that red line there. So you can see that New Hampshire has started out just really with everybody else near them, just really bad, like 50% or so, 60% of businesses were in normal operation or consider themselves a normal. Well, now it's 76. You can see that peak there. And that was in the fall when, if you remember, we had a serious resurgence in the COVID in New Hampshire and nationally. And you can see it coming back from that. You can see actually it started going down slowly in the fall, rose a little bit after Thanksgiving, and then plummeted again because Thanksgiving and, as we know, Christmas were not helpful to controlling COVID, as we found out the hard way, unfortunately. But I think that this is now, we're at 70%. And if you think that with the vaccination, with more optimism, that number, that back to normal number, will be going up pretty quickly. Certainly by the end of the summer, we'll see, well into the 80s or 90, and that's going to be that'll be a really good sign for New Hampshire. And actually, it shows the U.S. back to normal index there is actually higher than Massachusetts, because Massachusetts has some unusual situations that they've been hit even harder by the pandemic than their economy has been hit even harder by the pandemic than New Hampshire. So, I mean, I think that this is something that we should really be looking at, is this idea that there is optimism, there are the vaccinations, and that has really made things more, it makes things more it makes you more hopeful about where we're headed. And, before I get on to this, I just want to say one other thing before I talk about some of the headwinds we're also facing. One of the interesting things I came across is that in the New Hampshire Business Review, every month for a couple of decades, we have tracked monthly bankruptcies and monthly bankruptcy filings. And this past year was really interesting because the whole time, starting in April, we've decided, we figured we were going to have to be ready and report on these things, and we would see bankruptcies, hundreds and hundreds, as bad as it was in the Great Recession, where we would see 500-600 in a month at some point. Well, it was really interesting because in 2020, there were a total of 1,054 bankruptcies for the year, which is less than 100 per month, and almost 40% less than the total number in 2019. And we kept, all during the year, we did keep seeing this trend of 70 bankruptcies, 60 bankruptcies. And then by the end of the year, it was in the 50s, which was really, I'm not diminishing the poor individuals and the businesses that had to file for bankruptcy, but that's really nothing compared to what you would think in such a devastation of the economy. And I think that really does say something about the effects that the stimulus spending has had, that the government, the Paycheck Protection Program, obviously the very, well, at first very generous unemployment benefit enhancements, but still pretty generous unemployment enhancements, have helped people weather this storm better than they would have been able to in any way without the stimulus spending. But anyway, actually, I think I'd like to skip this slide. Slide. Thanks. So let me talk a little bit about this graying of New Hampshire again. As I said, New Hampshire has one of the oldest, it's one of the oldest populations in the state. And that has really been a concern for many years. Not that there's older people in the state, that's certainly not a bad thing, but that it's overwhelmingly older, and it's affecting the future of our economy in some ways that really can be troublesome going forward. As I talked about, the tight housing market and other factors that just might not be in the best long-term interest of the state's economy. Could you go to the next slide, please, Kaylee? This is something else about New Hampshire. The state has a very relatively low poverty rate. 7.3% was the last one. It's among the lowest in the country, but there are still nagging problems with access to good jobs in more rural areas, particularly the North Country, the communities of Grafton, Carroll, and especially Coas County. And if you can see those lines, the blue lines there show the poverty rate. And the orange, or whatever color it is, that orangish line shows the number of people in poverty. So those lines, the bars on the left, especially, that's the northern counties, Belknap, Carroll, Cheshire's a western county, Coas, and Grafton. Coas in particular has the highest poverty rate in the state, about almost 13%. If you can see that, because it's such a lightly populated county, it's about 5,000 people, maybe a little over 5,000 people, because the population of the whole county is about 30,000 or so. And that has really it's shown that part of the state has been in a really serious, I'm gonna be polite and say recession, for probably 30 years now, with just the demise of the American paper and pulp industry. That was once one of the great massive employers of the state, was the paper and pulp industry, and Berlin, the city up in the North Country, was the center of it in New Hampshire. It had a plant, the Brown Paper Company, which later became the James River Company, which at one point, I remember I started working at the New Hampshire Business Review in 1983. It was the largest employer in the state. That mill up in Berlin was the largest employer in the state, employed probably about 7,000 people. And those are really good paying jobs, union jobs. And, but since then, Coas County has been struggling to get an identity, for an economy. So it's just not Coas, it's Carroll County, Grafton County in particular. And there's some western counties as well, Cheshire and Sullivan County, which is where the city of Claremont is. They have also really been struggling, as opposed to counties like Hillsborough, where Manchester and Nashua are, which have very strong manufacturing tech industries, very strong financial services economies. The Seacoast, Portsmouth, Dover, Rochester, which have really been among the most successful economically in the state for at least the last 20 years. So anyway, go to the next slide, please. This also leads to a concern of mine that I think is something that New Hampshire needs to start thinking about we've been thinking about it for about 40 years now. It's the education system. Now, it's really a fact. I mean, it's like indisputable that, the better your education, the better your employment prospects. But because of the disparity in wealth in New Hampshire, in economic success, we talk about those northern counties there. What you can see is, you can see the green on this map are communities that have a very high taxable wealth per person. So the darkest green ones, I think there's 6 of them on this map, have a taxable property value wealth of $1 million per capita. And that means basically that if you need to raise money through your property tax to fund, let's say, like education, your tax rate's going to be pretty low, because you don't have to tax that much on $1 million to get your the money you need for education. While on the other side, you look at the pink communities, and that's a lot of them in New Hampshire, but many of them are centered on that left side, on the upper side of the map. That's very low property value per capita, as low as $40,000 per capita. So you're talking about some communities have $1 million to tax, others have 40,000. Now, in Berlin, which is that deepest red pink there, all the way up there at the top, they have a property tax rate of $39.82 per $1,000 in valuation in 2019. Then if you look at that dark pink going down a little bit on the right side, that's Moultonborough, which is on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee. Very, very nice town. So it's not that far from Berlin. And it has a tax rate of $7.15 per thousand. And I just want to say, which community do you think has the higher performing school district? That's pretty obvious, but this is a situation that we've been facing in New Hampshire, as I said, for many years. There was the lawsuit filed by several what we call property poor districts that was heard in the Supreme Court, and they ruled in 1989, I believe, in the first case, that basically that the state's tax system was inequitable, and the state has been, I say, grappling ever since, or basically other people might say they're trying to be sweeping it under the rug ever since. And the problem has gotten worse in the last 30 years. So it's really, in terms of helping the whole state emerge economically strong, this is something that really needs to be considered as we move forward. Anyway, I just want to say that that's really just my talk about this. I don't mean to be a bummer on it, because I really do believe that with COVID's not in the rearview mirror by any way, but it's still, we're still going to have to see how things come out. But I do think, I say here, it'll be an uneven recovery. I think it's going to be uneven only because I think some sectors will come out of it much quicker than others. And I don't need to go into those details. I've talked about it a lot. But the shortage of affordable housing is a major concern going forward. The two New Hampshires, the benefits of the economic growth have not been evenly distributed among the communities and among the population. New Hampshire's population continues to age, but on the good side, it also is continuing to diversify. I didn't mention that, but we have seen a good trend of people coming from immigrants from other nations moving to New Hampshire, which has really helped certainly in bringing in skills, but also in helping us become a somewhat younger state. There's one of the concerns we could see is limited income growth for low-wage workers, because they're, even with automation, that's just one example. It's harder and harder for someone who's without education to get a decent job. But there are these great jobs in manufacturing tech. So that's another reason why we want to really just kind of boost the education system. And that's also tied into the resources for local education among the communities. It's very haphazard. You can't, it depends, you basically, your zip code determines what kind of education your child gets. And that's, a thing to consider. But on the whole, I don't want to leave you talking about a bummer here. So I'm going to say that I really do believe that things are much stronger than they were a year ago, without a doubt, obviously. But I also think that we are coming out of it, that with these various factors like the vaccinations, like the optimism we see among people, that I think that there'll be really pretty strong recovery coming out of this over the next couple of years. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me. And if you have any questions, I'll be taking them.
Okay, Jeff, we do have a question. I look forward to more questions. I just have one, but I just wanted to ask you a question myself, Jeff. We're finding in our sector, the long-term care, CCR world, that we are getting a lot of people from out of state that are moving here. Yeah. Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, New York, and through COVID, even more, as broad as California. So is that a trend? I mean, is that just a retirement thing, do you think? Or is that a trend in general, that people are attracted to New Hampshire?
No, I do think that it's a trend, and it's been really highlighted in COVID, because I do think that a lot of people have moved here. This is not just New Hampshire. It's true of Vermont and Maine as well, and other rural areas, that people have, with the ability to do this, and especially with more remote work, they can live in other parts of the country without having to be in a city. And if you remember, I'm from New York originally. My daughter and her husband live in New Jersey. They work in Manhattan, and that was and is it's still hard to navigate that world of going on the subway or the bus just being in New York, just like in Boston. Boston's a small city, but it's still densely populated. It's hard to avoid people, and if you're concerned about being near people, you want to go where there's not as many people. And I think that's something that I think that will continue, actually.
Okay. So right now I just have one question, and that is the legislative tax policy in New Hampshire changing?
No, it's not. It's especially this term. There's been there was a recommendation of a commission that was formed in the last legislature to look at school funding, and they came up with recommendations, and the current edition of the legislature has pretty much just giving it short shrift. And they're discussing it somewhat, but it's not going to happen. This is a very much a long-term issue in New Hampshire, and I think that it will remain like that. I think elected officials in a lot of ways they don't like to handle these tough issues. We see that in Washington all the time. So it's something that really, it would be nice if lawmakers in New Hampshire put on their big boy pants and big girl pants and address people, but they haven't done it yet. We're hoping, we keep our fingers crossed on that.
Oh, good. We've got a couple more questions. So any thoughts on the seasonality of the New Hampshire economy?
Yeah. Now, I have to say that that's one of the concerns I have in terms of Coos County and also the Lakes region. Not so much the Seacoast and other parts of like the Lake Sunapee area. But tourism is a major economic driver in the state, and I'll throw that in with also the outdoors recreational activities like skiing, and that has been that is a strong part of the state, but that's not the kind of I think in terms of providing jobs, there's a lot of jobs in those industries, in those businesses. But they're not like those manufacturing jobs. And I think that it's something that's there, and it's an attraction to the state. Having seasonal, these mostly recreational outdoors type of industries is great. It's absolutely great, but it's not what would be a major concern to me in terms of the economy recovering. I think it will. I think they do well when things go well. It's very obvious that New Hampshire is an attractive state. People come here to do things, to play, as they say. And it's something that just is. But the problem is it's concentrated. Those businesses are concentrated in parts of the state like Coos, the North Country, the Lakes region, where they could really actually use some better paying jobs as well.
So another question, should we assume it would be easier for a college educated young person to find a good job in New Hampshire?
Yeah, you can assume that very strongly. I mean, that's without a doubt is true. And I just I know that I've talked to employers over the years, and they actually have taken into their own hands educating people, even those with less than adequate educations, to do jobs in manufacturing, because they really need to find workers. So they find themselves in the job of training people in skills that they should have had before they found a job, but they don't have them necessarily. So if you come there with the skills, with the education, yes, it'll be much easier to get a job.
Great. And another question, would an increase in immigrants be good for our economy here in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I think it's already showing that it is. And we've done some work at the New Hampshire Business Review on this, and the immigrants who come here are, for the most part, educated people. They have skills that are needed. The only real thing is that sometimes they don't have the language skills. And that to me is a pretty minor barrier when you're looking at, if you're a company that's looking to fill a job of someone who a job that requires someone with intelligence and other kinds of skills. So I do think that that's really, it's really something that is good for our economy. And as I said, we were trying to attract younger people here. So if you bring someone, so someone comes here from another country, for the most part, they're going to be younger. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. And especially diversity also is a very good thing for our economy.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
know some people don't always agree with that, but I think that it's very important for the strength and health of not just the economy, but of the society in general.
General. That's great. Well, I think that's it. All we have for questions, Jeff, and this has been great. I feel a little bit optimistic after hearing your
I didn't mean to
talk.
bum anybody out.
I know, so cautiously optimistic, I will
Yes.
say. And we're grateful for the vaccines, and that's a move forward.
Exactly.
as
I have
you
mine
say.
on March 17th, a week from tomorrow.
Oh, good. That's great. That's great. So thank you so much for your time and your information. Very, very helpful to us. This recording will be emailed to all of you who joined, and it'll also be on our website. So for those of you that took the time today to listen, to tune in, as they say, zoom in, we thank you, and our heartfelt thanks to Jeff and his great information. He'll be on the exchange in a couple of weeks with
Yeah.
Laura Kanai. I had to say that, Laura Kanoi. So listen then if you're home and able to. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and look forward to seeing everyone in person. Let's hope next year, Jeff, we can see you in
See each other
person.
first. That'll be wonderful. That would actually
Okay,
be
thank
great.
you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.